Good evening and welcome to Q&A. I'm Tony Jones. Tonight with Sydney on catastrophic fire alert. Over 1 million hectares burnt, 3 dead and fires spreading across the nation. We'll examine not only the risks of climate change but the strategic economic opportunities. Now, answering your questions tonight, Chief Executive of the Australian Energy Council, Sarah McNamara. Economist turned Liberal MP, Jason Falinski. Chairman of Sunshot Energy, Professor Ross Garnaut, who wants Australia to become a renewable energy superpower. Silicon Valley CEO, Sarah Friar, head of local neighbourhood social media platform Nextdoor. And the Shadow Minister for Climate Change and Energy, Mark Butler. Please welcome our panel. Thank you. Now, Q&A is live in Eastern Australia on ABC TV, iView and News Radio. Well, our first question tonight comes from Poppy Burton.
With 150 fires burning across New South Wales and the devastating loss of lives and homes, our Prime Minister has offered thoughts and prayers. As young student leaders and citizens, we are more inclined for direct action. So we are collecting food and essential items to donate to regional areas. We would like to know why Prime Minister Morrison did not heed the warnings of Greg Mullins, the former Commissioner of Fire and Rescue New South Wales, and plan preventative action to avoid the devastation. I
start with Mark Butler.
Well, I'm probably not the best person to speak for the Prime Minister. Congratulations on the work.
You can speak about him.
I can speak about him. I'm pretty practiced at that. Congratulations on the work that you're doing to support the community here in New South Wales, but across the country increasingly, that are facing this extraordinary fire emergency. I have a particular view. I've held this portfolio for some years. I have a particular view that a long-standing protocol that we've had in Australia, that during an emergency we put political disputes on hold. There's an understanding that you don't engage in political debate while people are at risk, while our emergency services, our defence personnel sometimes are in harm's way trying to protect our community. And I think that's been a protocol that's stood us in good stead. But over the past several years, I think that's been put aside too much, and there is too much political debate during an emergency about who caused what, about who should have done something more than they did. And I think having a look at the TV news tonight, every single TV news led not with communities doing the sort of work that you guys are doing, but instead with a spat between Adam Bandt from the Greens and the Deputy Prime Minister Michael McCormack. And I just think that's a betrayal of so many people who are putting their lives at risk to save other Australians. And I don't just blame the Greens for doing this, because the Coalition has done it in the past. Malcolm Turnbull did it when South Australia went through an extraordinary storm event back in 2016. I mean, he practically tore a hamstring to run and get in front of a TV camera while people were still at risk, while communities were still being saved by ADF personnel or by emergency services personnel to make a political point about renewable energy. And I just think it's appalling. These are good people, Adam Bandt, Michael McCormack, they care deeply for their community, but let's just put the politics aside while the country is facing this sort of emergency. Let's instead do the sorts of things that you're doing, that we see volunteers and professional firefighters and other emergency services personnel across the country doing right now to keep us safe. Once that's finished, I think there is time for a very serious debate about the impact of climate change and what it is doing to our country. That time is overdue, but it's not right now.
Now, Greg Mullins probably would be here in the audience were he not off fighting fires. But he and 23 former fire chiefs did try to get an audience with the Prime Minister many months ago to warn about precisely this and to get the government ready for it. Is that not something you're happy to talk about?
Well, and the Prime Minister should take that meeting. The Energy Minister should take that meeting. Other relevant ministers should take that meeting, because we've had advice for years now from the Bureau, from the CSIRO, from the Australian Academy of Science and from emergency services chiefs that the fire season has got longer, it's got more intense, and it is impacting parts of the country that have never been impacted before. There are very serious practical issues in play. We know, for example, that California is still experiencing wildfires while we are. We've been advised by these emergency services chiefs that some of the arrangements that we took for granted in the past are not going to be possible anymore. For example, the sharing of the firefighting helicopter that we know as Elvis. We used to use it up in the Northern Hemisphere during their fire season, then lease it down here for Australia's fire season. Well, while fires are going on in California and in New South Wales and Queensland and elsewhere at the same time. These practical arrangements are deeply challenged. So, look, once this is over, the Prime Minister, other ministers need to start taking the advice of emergency services chiefs and of all our scientific agencies much more seriously, frankly, than they have now. But for today, and I suspect, unfortunately, for coming days, our focus should entirely be on keeping people safe.
Jason Falinski.
Tony. Poppy, can I thank you and your classmates for getting involved and collecting those goods and important things for people who are going to suffer during this natural catastrophe. In terms of our fire brigades in New South Wales, to which I can speak to, Shane Fitzsimons has made it clear that we have one of, if not the best funded and resourced fire service brigades in the world. John Barilaro, who is the Deputy Premier of New South Wales, has just returned from California, where Mark correctly pointed out they've got their own issues with bushfires going on at the moment, and that they were just blown away at the fact that Australia, or New South Wales, has a 70,000 volunteer army of firefighters that it can deploy into these areas. We have 4 aircraft. I know Mark's concerned that we don't have Elvis out here at the moment. Last year we bought a 15,000 litre aeroplane that can dump water on any spot fire anywhere in the state within an hour, and we have 3 other planes that have been leased for that purpose. We are about as well prepared for this as we possibly can be, including doing things like we are using machine learning, big data and supercomputers to predict where the fires will occur and at what time they will occur, so that our fire and rescue services can advise people when they have the opportunity, before it is too late, to leave their homes behind so that they can get to safety. The next 24 hours, the next 7 days will be critical for what happens in New South Wales. I know that some people think that it's pat, but our thoughts and prayers are with those people in harm's way, and we should thank those who volunteer on a regular basis to put their lives on hold to save those people and their property, and because they turn this Australia from just being a name into a community, and we should be very grateful.
Okay, we've got a firefighter in the audience with a question. Let's go to James Lavery.
Hi there, I'm James. I'm a firefighter. My question's in regards to the ongoing cuts to frontline fire services across the country, including here in our state of New South Wales. How do you see both federal and state governments' role in properly funding fire services and responding to our prediction that things will get worse, particularly in the context of growing threat of climate change?
Jason, I'll go back to you to answer that, because it was also partly in the first question as well.
James, could I ask, are you a member of the Rural Fire Service or the Fire and
No, I'm a professional firefighter with fire rescue.
So you're a professional fire service, okay. So that, as you know, is a service that has always been delivered by state governments. I can't speak to your question. I am assured by the New South Wales Government that any request that is made by those people who run your organisation, both the Rural Fire Service and Fire and Rescue in New South Wales, that they have never been denied a request for more funding or more equipment where it is required. So I can't say more than that. All I can say is what I'm being told, what Shane Fitzsimons, who's the head of Rural Fire Service, is saying today in New South Wales, that we have never been better prepared, and there is no firefighting brigade anywhere in the world that is better funded and better resourced than the New South Wales RFS. In my area, there are 23 brigades. 22 of them have sent people north to help with the fires that are on the mid-north coast at the moment, and that's a great thing and something that we should celebrate.
Can I just ask a quick question of you, and then I want to actually go back to our firefighter, who happens to be a member of the union, and I'm actually wondering if that's part of the reason why the former fire chiefs were not seen by the Prime Minister. Is there a sense that those who are out fighting and not union members are different or have different views philosophically about the way this is unfolding?
Well, I can't speak for the Prime Minister or his diary manager, but what I can say is that that would have absolutely nothing to do with it.
So you think the Prime Minister should meet those 23 fire chiefs who tried to meet him in April and then again in September, with the idea of warning him that precisely this sort of thing would happen?
Well, look, as I say, I don't know why the Prime Minister hasn't met with those fire chiefs as of yet. He's a very busy person. As I understand it, they were asked to meet.
Should he meet them?
Well, I think at this point that's a decision for him. But yeah, look, I think that at least the minister, at very least, should take the time to meet with them and hear from them. I understand that meeting's underway.
Just before I go to our other panellists, you've got your hand back up there, and I'd go back to our firefighter.
Sorry, just with fire rescue, this year they had $13 million cut from...
So that's not true. The reason that there was a $13 million decrease in your capital budget is because in the previous financial year you had a new headquarters built, and we're not, the New South Wales government is not going to build a new headquarters for fire and rescue every year.
James, can I go back to the core of your earlier question? What is it that professional firefighters are seeing that's happening, and why are you guys in particular focused on the climate change issue?
Well, we've noticed over the last few years, I've been in the fire brigade with fire rescue for nearly 10 years. The fires are getting worse. The resources that we have, they're not there. We need more firefighters on the ground. And to be honest, without more firefighters on the ground, these things will continue to happen.
Sarah, you've seen this in California. Mark just mentioned that the wildfires have been extraordinary and unprecedented. How have the governments there responded, and how are they dealing with this issue of climate change? Or are they linking the fires to climate change? Perhaps I should put it that way.
It's a loaded question. In California itself, there is no debate on whether or not it's linked to climate change. We're sure the science proves it. Whatever you read shows that it has a scientific underpinning. And exactly as your firefighter is saying, right, these seasons are getting longer and longer. Our countries are getting drier and drier. It is compounded by having, in our case, an electric utility that in and of itself has not been well managed. So we have most of our cables are above ground. And then I think the third compounding effect in California is we're also very much in love with our countryside. We don't like to cut back our trees ever. And so when these high winds happen, trees come down, they bring down power lines, and they start fires like last year's devastating Camp Fire that took out the whole town of Paradise. So it is very unnerving at a federal level.
I was going to say, are there different views at a state? And
yeah.
Obviously the White House has a view about climate change.
Absolutely, and unfortunately the US just pulled out officially now from the Paris Agreement, the Paris Accord. And so, it's devastating, I think, sitting in a state like California and seeing the impact, to imagine that we can't just all believe the science. I mean, I think last week alone, 1,600 scientists put their name to the fact that not just is climate change happening, but it's happening at a much more rapid rate. And our ability as just a human population to start to stop it is that window is closing.
I'm going to quickly go to our next question before I bring in the other panellists. From Alan Fisher, it's on a related subject. Alan.
Yeah, so this morning the Deputy Prime Minister said that any links between climate change and the current bushfire tragedy were the ravings of inner-city lunatics. Is it fair to say that the government's internal view of climate change hasn't really moved on since Tony Abbott's stance on that the so-called settled science of climate change was absolute crap?
I'm going to bring in Ross Garnaut. I know it's a highly political question, Ross, but can you give us your perspective on it?
Well, the science has been very clear since I described it all in my report 11 years ago for all the state governments and the federal government. I was simply absorbing into that report what was coming out from the science, and it told us that if we didn't change the trajectory of growing greenhouse gas emissions and greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere, then we were going to get the conditions for difficult bushfires much more frequently and more frequently over time, and the bad ones would be much worse. And unfortunately, it looks like the science was right.
Jason, do you want to talk to the politics of that question?
I'm not sure what the politics are per se, Tony, but let me say, Michael...
Well, the central argument in that question was that the government is still denying climate change, as Tony Abbott did. That was the question.
So Tony Abbott didn't deny climate change, and the federal government does not...
Say the science was crap, whether that's a denial or not, technically speaking.
So let me leave that aside. But the
can't leave facts aside.
No, that's a problem. I agree. But The fact of the matter is that the Abbott government signed the Paris Agreement. That's also a fact that we can't leave aside. This government accepts and endorses the science of climate change. We understand that the climate change is a contributing factor to the weather events that we are having, including natural disasters at the moment. There is no one in the government who doesn't accept that.
Oh, really?
Yes, really.
Well, there was an LNP senator on television this afternoon saying the Bureau of Meteorology is manipulating data to suit their global warming agenda.
Well,
just this afternoon.
I don't think that's true. If you're
It is.
referring to Senator Rennick, that's not what he said. That's not what he said, Mark. And I mean, this is what the Labor Party constantly tries to do, constantly tries to say, oh, those in the Liberal Party are climate deniers because it suits your political purposes. And I thought you didn't want to play politics in the middle of a natural disaster.
Well, I mean, he's answering a question, to be fair, and I suppose it is a political question, but what about Michael McCormack's comments?
Well, I thought they were ill-timed. I thought they were an overreaction. I don't agree with what Adam Bandt did. And I've said that about some of Adam's tweets going back to the Blue Mountains bushfires many years ago. I think they're very poorly timed. And I think that they breached that long-standing protocol I was talking about. Now, I think Michael McCormack's the Deputy Prime Minister. He could have stayed above that and chosen to ignore it. I hadn't even seen Adam Bandt's tweets until Michael McCormack rushed onto radio this morning to start an even bigger Barney with him. It seemed to me that Michael almost seemed to enjoy getting into this fight, and I thought that was beneath the office of Deputy Prime Minister, frankly. And as I said, instead of the TVs tonight showing communities binding together to support all of those bushfire-affected communities across the country, instead we had a very unseemly spat between two federal parliamentarians.
Sarah McNamara, how's this look from your perspective?
Well, from my perspective, the kind of tussle we've even had at the table tonight, Tony, just illustrates the politicisation of climate change policy in this country. And it's been a real barrier to us being able to settle on a bipartisan climate change policy framework, which in the energy industry we've been crying out for since around 2006. So what we do need to try and do...
Do you think that politics from both sides is getting in the way of it?
Absolutely, absolutely. And it's only if we can take the politics and the ideology out of the climate change debate, accept that we all agree on the science and work on real answers and real policy frameworks to deal with the issue of climate change and calm down the very understandable anxieties we're seeing in drought and bushfire affected communities and also amongst inner city latte sippers.
Yeah, but how do you think you could take the politics out of it? What would have to happen? What would have to happen to cool things down to the degree where you got bipartisanship around these issues and how to deal with them? We saw what happened with the NEG, for example. The Prime Minister lost his job over that one.
Well, the National Energy Guarantee came very close to being successful, and I think one of the reasons it was almost successful was that it had incredibly broad stakeholder support, and that's really very rare in a contested policy environment. So the energy industry and other stakeholders are ready and willing to have that conversation again with state and federal governments about how we best design our market to deal with climate change policy.
We've got a question on this. I'm going to go straight to that one. Abhi Nithyanand.
Yeah, I just came back from Europe where there's a big decoupling of energy policy from the politics, and this has really fueled investment in energy in Europe. And two big examples of poor energy policy in Australia is one is the carbon tax, which came in and went back, and the NEG, which was almost brought in and repealed. So as a result of this, do you think energy policy should be decoupled from politics completely and handed over to the regulators?
I'll start with Ross Garnaut here. What do you think about that idea that actually you could actually give up the power, the government should give up the power and allow experts to actually deal with it?
Like you, Ross.
Yeah, well, let's not forget that we were in that place. When I was commissioned to do the first climate change review, it was every government in Australia, 6 state governments, 2 territory governments and the federal government were part of it and had strong support of the opposition. I met regularly with the leader of the opposition and leading members of the front bench, Malcolm Turnbull, and members of the front bench, and they gave full support to it. So
what happened, Ross?
Not only was it bipartisan, but it was across the federation. And we were ready to make a very strong move. Unfortunately, Malcolm Turnbull lost his job by a single vote the day before the Senate was due to pass the legislation that had gone through the House of Representatives. The rest is history.
Yeah, sure, Jason. The rest is history. We know, but politics has reared its ugly head every time there seems to be a solution in sight. Do you accept blame for that as a politician? I'm going to ask the same of Mark.
Well, yes, absolutely. I mean, it's our job to show leadership and find consensus. I guess I would slightly disagree with you in the sense that we are making progress. I'd slightly disagree with the questioner whose name I've forgotten, I apologise. I don't think Europe is... Harvey, sorry, Harvey. I don't think Europe is actually some sort of utopia of energy policy in the world. Its emissions are going up, they're unlikely to meet their Paris Agreement targets, and their prices are higher. In Australia, we have managed, through good luck, good management, to actually reduce our emissions. Our trend line is down, our energy prices are coming down, and we have actually made progress in this area.
Mark Butler, so it's the same question to you. I mean,
Am I an upside down world, am I?
Well, you may well be.
Well, energy prices released this morning are $86 a megawatt hour, which is over 20% higher than they were when Malcolm Turnbull was last Prime Minister. Emissions have been rising since Tony Abbott was Prime Minister and are projected by the government to continue rising all the way to 2030. Just have a look at the government's greenhouse data, their own department record. They rose over the last 12 months. They've been rising over the last several years. They're projected to rise all the way to 2030. So we'll miss our Paris targets, according to the government's greenhouse data they publish every year, by about 19%. So we are really failing on emissions and energy prices. And you can look just across the ditch to New Zealand, which passed in a bipartisan way a very substantial carbon reduction bill. You look to the United Kingdom, which is not a polite democracy. This is a democracy that practices its politics very vigorously, but has taken the politics out of climate change for more than a decade, to the point where their emissions are now lower than they were at any time since Queen Victoria was on the throne. They're 2/3 of the rate of our emissions, but they still produce 50% more steel than we do. They still have hundreds of thousands of...
Would you like to get a nuclear power like they did?
Well, no, I'm talking about reductions in emissions from a point when they still did have nuclear power. So point to point, the nuclear power question hasn't changed. They've been able to do it because they've had policy certainty.
OK, I'm just going to quickly go back to... Harvey's got his hand up. I'll go back to him.
Yeah, sorry, I strongly disagree when you say prices are coming down, because before the carbon tax, wholesale prices were about $28, $30. Carbon tax came, it could have pushed it up to 45, repealed. More political uncertainty. Wholesale energy prices are well above $80 and $90 at the moment.
Let's go to Sarah, because she's got expertise in this subject.
Well, look, it's certainly true that wholesale prices are higher than we'd like them to be at the moment. I think, Jason, you were referring to retail prices, which with the introduction of the default market offer by the federal government has seen some price reductions at the retail end. But I do think it's not always helpful to compare Australia's challenges with the challenges or the success stories elsewhere in the world, because we have a very particular grid. We are an islanded grid. We are a long and skinny grid. We don't have access to nuclear or to adjoining countries' energy if we're running out. And we've got a relatively small population sort of clustered in certain capital cities up and down the East Coast. So those challenges need to be met, and we're doing our level best in the energy sector to meet them. And I should say the energy sector is decarbonising and transitioning to a more renewables-based electricity generation source. But that is going to take time, and we're working on it, but we really need to make sure that we're keeping the lights on and that we're keeping energy as affordable as possible, because we do acknowledge that people are doing it tough when it comes to paying their energy bills at the moment. OK, I'm going to go to our next question, which Ross will want to respond to. It's from Lakendra Maharshi.
So my question is, Ross Garnaut believes that Australia had more to lose from rising carbon emissions than other wealthy nations, and more to gain from acting. And he argues that Australia could emerge as a global superpower in energy, low-carbon industry, and carbon absorption technology. So my question is this. People don't like losing their jobs. nor do they like changing them. But what exactly does Australia lose by not acting on climate change? And what incentives do Australians need to prioritize mitigating climate change over current comfort?
OK, Ross, this is your core argument of your new book, so let's go.
Well, all of my analysis back 10 years ago showed that Australia would be the most damaged by unconstrained climate change of all the developed countries. We're already a hot and dry country, and unfortunately the experience of today is part of that story, but there's a lot more to that story. Our agriculture is closer to the margins of dryness and high temperature under which agriculture works. But at the same time, we've got by far the world's richest combination of renewable energy resources, of wind and solar. And we've also got extraordinary opportunities for capturing carbon in the landscape, which is another part of the world story of moving to zero emissions. If we use this opportunity well, if we don't muck it up, then we should be the country with the lowest cost energy. And if we're the country with the lowest cost energy, we should be the country that turns our own iron ore, iron oxide, into iron metal, the country that turns our own aluminium oxide into aluminium metal.
So you mean lowest cost energy by becoming a renewable superpower? That's your central argument.
That's right, and I think if we do this well, then it can open up a new era of prosperity for Australia, so that doing what we need to do to save ourselves from the very large difficulties and disruption of climate change can make us richer, can improve our economic status in the world, and provide lots more opportunities for Australians.
Just in the interest of full transparency, can you just set out briefly your financial stake in various renewable energy companies? Because you need to put that on the table before we start going through why it's such a great idea to expand renewable energy.
Right, and I do that in the book.
I know. But for the audience here.
Yeah, I'm chairman of a company, Sunshine Energy, that's seeking to lead the Australian zero emissions energy transition. And I'm a shareholder still in the group led by Sanjeev Gupta, bringing low emissions steel making to South Australia. And in this role, then I hope to help lead the Australian effort and at the same time build a strong company. Well,
you know that the government champions entrepreneurs, so it should be no problem with that. But what I'm actually going to ask you to describe briefly is how you do this. If you become a renewable superpower, how does it work? How do you actually get cost-effective renewable energy that can make steel? That can be used to make steel, it can be used to make aluminium and process various other metals. Because your essential argument is we can do all of these things and be the exporter of the cheapest metals to the world. Now, that's a vision that no one's gotten their head around right now. So just tell us how you do that.
Yeah, well, steel's got two routes to manufacture. One is recycling of scrap steel, and if you use renewable energy for that, it's green steel. And that's very important in the world, very important in developed countries. But the big one for Australia and the big one for the world is turning iron ore into iron metal. 7% of global emissions are from using coal to turn iron ore into iron and steel. 3% of global emissions come from turning Australian iron ore into iron and steel using coal. There's another route, there's a zero emissions route, and that is by using hydrogen. I've got half a chapter in the book on how important this can be for Australia. But if we've got the iron ore here and we can produce renewable energy, which is the essential ingredient into zero emissions hydrogen, if we've got them both here at lower cost than anywhere else in the world, we would have to be fairly irrational to find ways of avoiding becoming the natural exporter of iron metal. It won't make the slightest sense in the world to take Australian iron ore to Japan or Korea, and when Japan and Korea are committed to being zero emissions economies by the middle of the century, won't make any sense at all to take Australian iron ore to Japan or Korea and to take Australian hydrogen to Japan and Korea and to turn that into metal, because hydrogen doesn't liquefy until it's nearly at absolute zero. You lose half the energy turning it into a liquid, and then you've got the very high costs of transporting this rather difficult element across the ocean. So the economically sensible place to do all that will be here in Australia. And a lot of the places will be the places that will lose their coal jobs. The natural places are the Upper Spencer Gulf of South Australia, Collie and Geraldton in Western Australia, Gladstone in Queensland, Newcastle in New South Wales. And these are going to be more jobs and better jobs than are currently in the coal industry.
OK, I want to hear from the politicians in a minute, but I want to hear from Sarah, because California has sort of prized its role as one of the renewable superpowers in the world. It's a much bigger economy than Australia, actually.
That's right.
So how does that kind of vision work?
Yeah, the 6th largest economy in the world. I'm surprised at how much the entire conversation, and I think it came a little bit from Arby's question, was that the role here was government or regulators, and those were your two choices. And I'm surprised to not hear about the private sector and also just communities at large. So on the private sector side, I also have the privilege of sitting on the board of Walmart, which is the largest company in the world by revenue. And Walmart actually took on very aggressive green targets, if you go back kind of 10, even 15 years ago. For example, in California, all Walmart stores have to be a zero power footprint, so solar panels on roofs, but a lot of work done in stores. But what a company like Walmart can go on to do is actually to then push on suppliers and push on a whole supply chain to make a change. And so I'm surprised not to hear much more about what private industry can do, because frankly, I love our government folks, but at the highest level, it feels like we're not getting very much done across the globe. And then on the community side, back to Poppy's original question, what I loved hearing there was this rise from the grassroots level, right? Local is actually where we're getting things done at the moment, because people are kind of sick of hearing all of the macro politic debate go on. And instead they're saying, okay, we're going to take it upon ourselves. So what I see go on in California is a lot of grassroots push around things like electric vehicles, a lot of grassroots push around how are we as communities, what is going to be our particular approach to a more renewable future for our children. And so that to me feels like we should be talking more about that, something Nextdoor is very proud to help put in front of people a platform where those conversations can begin. But communities, grassroots efforts, and the private sector, I'd love to hear more of that.
Yeah, we're going to hear a little bit more about your platform in a moment. But let me go to Mark. And there's a vision being spelled out here, a vision for how Australia could change. I mean, are you on board with that?
Oh, I don't think it's particularly controversial anymore. I think for some time now, studies have shown that once the world economy has transitioned to clean energy, Australia will have the cheapest electricity of all of our major competitors, the US, Europe, China, India, because of the points that Ross made. We have the best solar radiation on the planet. We have some fantastic wind resources in the south of the continent. The question is how we're going to manage the transition and whether we can surf this wave or whether it's going to crash on us. And I think that's the $64 trillion question for us.
We have seen a massive increase in investment in renewable energy programs, huge renewable energy programs in the past 2 years.
To discharge the renewable energy target, which has come to an end now. So Bloomberg has said that renewable energy investment has collapsed by 50% this year. The Clean Energy Council says it might be more. The market operator said this morning that this is the third month. October was the third month with no new solar or wind investment. And that was the implication of the collapse of the National Energy Guarantee. I mean, the whole purpose of that investment framework was to provide private investors with some confidence going forward after the RET, the renewable energy target, was fully discharged, which it was this year. So
Okay,
there is an
all right, I want to go to Jason to hear about that. Okay, go ahead.
Sorry, can I go to this point about manufacturing? It is critically important. So in Whyalla, which was used as a bit of a case study about a town that was going to be wiped off the map because of the carbon tax, we now have confidence in my state of South Australia, in that second steel town, at record highs, because the new buyer of those steelworks has decided that the best way to guarantee the viability of our second blast furnace in the country is through renewable energy. I mean, it's showing that this can be done. In aluminium, there is a very serious question now being discussed among all of the big global aluminium producers and customers like Apple about how do you produce zero emissions aluminium. I mean, that is the big question over Alcoa's plants, because they've decided, they announced a couple of weeks ago, they want 85% of their aluminium within the next 5 years to be produced using renewable energy. That is the thing that's hanging over the Portland plant in Victoria. But there's nothing coming from federal policy to assist manufacturing plants to make that transition.
Okay, now on my way through to Jason and to Sarah, I just want to hear quickly from Ross Garnaut as to whether the renewable energy target being renewed is core to what you're talking about, or whether private investment will take this up independently.
Well, there are a lot of problems in the current regulatory framework that inhibits rapid growth of new industry. I make a number of suggestions in the book, but the most important of them, I think, to start building this new vision, and none of them are inconsistent with electoral commitments of the government or the opposition at the last election. But first of all, implementation of a recommendation of the ACCC in their review of the electricity sector. Secondly, there needs to be ways for private investors to be able to build private unregulated transmission lines and be able to link to the main lines in ways that reward them for the value that they add to the regulated system. For the industries that I'm talking about, the zero emissions metals, they are the crucial changes that need to be introduced.
And is the renewable energy target key to that, or does it not matter?
I think
because the investment will happen anyway.
No, I think if you've got those things, the investment will happen anyway. But the investment won't happen anyway if we just keep in place the current uncertainty, the current mess, and the possibility that the government will subsidise a coal plant that will make other forms of energy uncompetitive.
Okay, well, that's Jason, over to you, and then we'll hear from Sarah on that subject. So, I mean, are you going to subsidise a coal-fired power station? Because that's certainly on the cards, isn't it?
No, that's not an option we're considering.
So it's gone off the cards, is it?
Tony, the fact of the matter is that
that is
it's hard to know.
I'm serious about that.
And I'll
you're
answer
saying
the question.
That's actually news, isn't it?
No, it is without doubt the reason that Whyalla is currently happening is because the South Australian government just opened a gas peaker. Renewable energy is a fantastic form of energy, but unless you have reliability in either the form of batteries, for which the technology does not currently exist, or pumped hydro or hydro generally that can come into the market, or gas peakers, you are simply not going to get people bringing more renewable energy into the market. We have had a 40% increase in renewable energy in the last 2 years. It had nothing to do with the RET. It's because we have had
we've just heard exactly the opposite analysis.
I understand.
From
Mark, absolutely. Yep. It's because we've had very high subsidies for it. It has been a very good form of energy to add to the marketplace. We, as of February next year, will enter a very exclusive club of 3 countries, being Denmark, Germany and ourselves, where we have 1 kilowatt per capita of renewable energy being produced in Australia. I mean, that is an incredible story.
So you're on board with Australia becoming a renewable energy superpower, which is...
Absolutely. The point that Ross is not talking about, but is in his book, is that he also talks about where we get dispatchable power from. Does it come from gas? Does it come from hydro? Does it come from, I did see mentioned nuclear? Are these places that we need to go? That's the missing part of what we have in our electricity grid at the moment. So just one example, last night in Sydney, which is not a high energy demand time, when the sun went down, wholesale prices went from $55 a kilowatt hour to $321 a kilowatt hour. To to manage that, the Snowy Hydro and the Tumut 3 generator, I'm told, released a lot of water to pump energy, pardon the pun, pump energy into the New South Wales market to halve that price. They're the sorts of mechanisms that we need in place.
Let's. I'll come back to you, Ross. Let's hear from Sarah.
Thank you. So the renewable energy target has been a huge success story. We now see renewables making up around 21% of our energy mix, and in the energy sector we're really proud of that, and we're expecting to see an increasing penetration of renewables as we transition away from more fossil fuel baseload power. But the real challenge for us at the moment is we're not getting the private investment in that firming generation we so badly need to keep the lights on when the sun's not shining and the wind's not blowing. And the reason for that is that we are absent a policy framework to give investors the confidence to know what the rules of the game are when they are coming into the market to build the kind of generation we need to stabilise it.
Whose job is it to build that policy framework?
Well, it's largely a federal government question. It's also a conversation that industry can have with government and has been trying to have with successive governments over the last decade.
Without success?
Well, we have not yet landed on a bipartisan climate and energy policy framework, and that has infected the investment signals that are sent to markets where private investors would otherwise enter and spend enormous amounts of money to build long-life assets necessary to stabilise our system.
So hang on, all right, go ahead.
There was one thing, which is also we're leaving the state governments out of this discussion as well. Victoria has banned...
Well, that's why I asked the question, is who's responsible?
Well, Victoria has banned any further extraction of natural gas, conventional gas. New South Wales is actually building 2 import terminals rather than extracting gas that it has on its land. We are the Saudi Arabia of natural gas. The Northern Territory has just allowed exploration to commence in the basin, and the Queensland government is now talking about allowing exploration to begin. That's got to be part of the problem that we are facing in Australia.
OK, Ross, a brief summary of your position.
Yeah, thanks, Jason, for reminding me of the third of my policy, which was to establish a Commonwealth reliability corporation to back up the system. And I would give that body, and I suggest it be a part of the Snowy Hydro responsible for pumped hydro, take that out and give that the responsibility to build Snowy 2.0 if that's the lowest cost way of doing it, to do other things if there are other lower cost ways of getting the peaking. But I think that is a very important part of the overall story. There are lots of things that have to come together to properly balance very low cost solar and wind. Their current technologies for the many hours of shifting power from one generation one time of the day to producing another time. Pumped hydro storage is very good, and we've got low-cost sources in Australia. Snow is not actually the lowest cost. There's a big role for more high-voltage transmission so we can diversify solar and wind, get it from different places at different times, because when the wind's blowing in the Eyre Peninsula in South Australia, it might not be blowing in northern New South Wales. There's a lot of capacity if you engineer the new industrial systems to deliberately manage demand so that they can lower production, lower use of energy at times when prices are very high and when there's a shortage of power. That can be an important part of the story, and a modern aluminium plant can make a very big contribution.
So can I just boil down what you're saying to you need some form of central planning to make this happen?
Don't say yes.
No, I'm going to back your policy on Snowy Hydro.
Thank you.
Snowy Hydro's project might not be the best project, but the idea of a Commonwealth authority playing a backup role for reliability, I think, is a good idea.
OK, let's move on. Maybe you hear any doubtful claims on Q&A, let us know on Twitter. Keep an eye on the RMIT ABC Fact Check and the Conversation website for the results. The next question comes from Jing Yu.
So the US has an active angel capital environment for risky startup ideas in Silicon Valley, but Australia seems to be more conservative. Investing in risky ideas is fundamental for economic breakthrough. So how can we encourage this risk-taking culture in Australia?
Sarah Friar.
It's a great question because it's true not just Australia, I don't sound it, but I grew up in the UK, I grew up in Northern Ireland, and I think we face all the same problems in Europe as well. What I've seen in Silicon Valley is an ecosystem. It actually begins with universities, which you have great universities here. So you have the beginning building block. But then you need the capital. But capital is largely available and free in the world right now. We're in a zero interest rate environment, so capital is there. And then the third piece is, as you said, teaching investors as well as companies how to invest with more of a long-term frame of mind. And the thing I see most often made as a mistake, I'm more au fait with the UK market than the Australian market, is that investors think that managing risk means giving companies smaller chunks so that they have to hit a milestone before they get the next chunk. As a CEO of a startup, the worst thing that you can do to me is distract me from job number one, which is building my company. And when you make me go on the road to fundraise for the next little breadcrumb, you are effectively preventing me from building a big company. And I think that's what Silicon Valley has gotten right, is that there's less of this kind of teasing small amounts of investment capital, and there's much more willingness to lean in. Now, with that brings risks. That's why you have a portfolio. But in particular, once you start getting that flywheel going and you see serial entrepreneurs, so their first venture may not have worked, but you actually want to reward the fact that they learned a lot, that's actually when you start to see investments kicking into gear and actually being successful, because you get a serial entrepreneur that's not going to make the same mistakes the second time around. So I would say it's, one, don't tease people with small amounts of capital. If you're going to invest, give them the money. Two, reward people for going through multiple iterations. And then three, it's where the whole ecosystem comes to play. So you need to start with the seed investors, but make sure that there's hands as you go up the cap table through your A round, your B round, to ultimately whatever your growth round is, and then have a public market that's ready for those ventures that can make it to the other side and be a big public market cap.
You talked about capital being almost free. Just give us an idea of the scale of what's available, because the digital economy is now, in a very relatively short space of time anyway, worth something like $30 trillion US dollars. So within that, that's a huge pool of capital.
Yeah, and so when you look at most Silicon Valley seed rounds, you're talking about companies that are still getting a couple of $1 million to get going. And again, when I go back and look at markets like the UK, and I suspect Australia is similar, it's almost like you get a tenth. Everything's about a tenth of the scale. If you look at a company like my own company, Nextdoor, we've raised almost $500 million. We're still young in our evolution as a company in terms of monetizing the platform that we've built, but investors are leaning in because they're willing to say, okay, you've proven in the US that you can do this, now you're in 11 countries, but we know that playbook will come. So there is definitely capital available, and investors are looking desperately across the whole cap table for any sort of return at the moment. So I actually think the bigger danger on my side of the fence is not taking the capital. What you really are taking is the wisdom and the help of a really strong investor to help you with the business that you are in, not just kind of where the money is, but where's the actual advice that's going to come, the folks who are going to dig in and work right alongside you in the trenches.
Jason, I see you nodding there, and of course you want social media entrepreneurs and others to emerge in Australia and to get access to this
That's
massive
what the world
pool
needs, more
of
social
capital.
media.
Yeah, that's right. Well, I mean, that just happens to be this case, but there's many opportunities in the digital economy. So why isn't it happening here in Australia to the scale that it is in Silicon Valley? Are we kind of behind? Are we behind the issue here?
Well, yes, we are. I think Sarah has left one really important factor out, which we all take for granted when we're in the middle of it, which is culture. And in Silicon Valley, it's the one place in the world, I'm sure there are others, but it's the one place in the world where if you say, have you failed? And you say, no, I've never failed, they go, well, see you once you've failed. Silicon Valley celebrates your successes as well as your failures, because there's that great Thomas Edison quote about it took him 10,000 experiments to get the light bulb to work, and in New York Times journalist came and saw him about 7,500 experiments in that had failed. And he said, why don't you just give up? And he said, you don't understand, I'm 7,500 times closer to solving this problem. And that is something that Silicon Valley does really well.
So what's wrong with the culture in Australia that doesn't happen?
Well, it's not just Australia. I mean, I would argue, Sarah's better placed to answer this than me. I think there are large parts in the United States where failure is frowned upon as well. Houston and Dallas seem to be places where that's changing. New York, of course, is a great place for failures. We won't get into that. And Silicon Valley as well.
And bankrupts, right?
Well, I'm not going to say that.
Okay.
But I think there's that, and also in Australia, our regulations in terms of the way that we distribute capital, we have put a lot more responsibility back on banks and bankers in order that the borrower takes no risk and the lender has all the risk. And one great innovation we have out of the United States, which is really gumming up our system, is litigation funders and shareholder class actions, which have got a lot of directors in Australia just jumping at shadows at the moment.
Okay, a lot of people want to hear more about Sarah's platform. We have a question about it from Sebastian Wolf.
Thanks, Tony. Hi, Sarah Fry, this question's for you. So, Nextdoor is an application that's built to create trust in stronger neighbourhoods. It's been described as the anti-Facebook. But how is this community building and not simply marketing? Why should we trust another private company to run this initiative?
Thank you, Sebastian. I appreciate the question. So let me give you a little bit of the differences. So Nextdoor is founded on trust. One of the key tenets when you come into Nextdoor is that we verify that you are a real neighbor living in that neighborhood. And so it's actually a bit more of a friction-full onboarding process. It's a very Silicon Valley term. But we actually take the time to really make sure it's you.
A friction-full onboarding process.
A friction-full, because Silicon Valley loves frictionless. Like, zip, you're in, and off you go, you're on the platform. The second thing that we do is that once you're in the platform, we really lean into this idea of proximity over preference. And what I mean by that is Nextdoor is creating a local graph. So Facebook is creating your friend graph, LinkedIn creating your professional graph. And often in local, you actually don't know the people who live around you, right? This is one of the reasons the founders got so excited about this idea was the fact that we see more and more communities, frankly, starting to dissolve, right? We probably all grew up knowing our neighbors. I lived in my neighbor's house. And yet many of us, most of us today, in Australia, 1 in 4 people talk about being lonely at least 2 to 3 times per week.
You see, Facebook claims to be creating communities. If you're the anti-Facebook, what's actually different? I mean, apart from it being smaller scale.
So go back to this idea that first and foremost, you know who's in your network. So there's no trolls, there's no bots. People are acting in a much more community-minded, kind way. And we think that's a big part of a community build. We've gone as far to try to insert more safety by design. So actually I was meeting with the e-safety commissioner earlier today. We worry about incivility building on the platform. We've seen it in Facebook groups. So I had a member meetup today, and a number of them talked about the toxicity of Facebook in these larger groups, because it's almost people become unaccountable because there's just such a mass number of people. So if you go back to a smaller group where you are that real person, it's your name and your address when you post, and we put in place something called a kindness reminder. So using ML, when we see content that's about to get posted that we know is likely to get reported, we actually pull up a little modal, and we're doing a couple of things there. We're trying to slow you down.
Can I interrupt you for 1 second on the slowing people down thing? I will slow you down for 1 second. There has been a sort of critique of some elements of this. For example, the crime in communities. There's been a suggestion that the neighbourhoods engage in racial profiling. Oh, we've seen a black person in the neighbourhood, maybe there's crime happening, and that actually creates incivility, the very thing that you're trying to avoid. Right. How do you deal with that?
So slowing down. We spent a bunch of time talking to a range of academics on this point. And so in our reptilian brain, our biases are rampant, right? They keep us alive. So when we're asked to go fast, which is what so many social platforms do, right? Post, engage, like, you lose all of the part that you've learned up here in your cognitive brain, which says, oh, maybe I'm being biased. Oh, that my brain is telling me to do one thing, but I know from experience that's not the case. So in the kindness reminder, we pop that up and we let you know that we bring you back to here because we ask you to read something that says, great communities are created with kindness. In crime and safety posts, we actually slowed you down and have you actually describe what's happening. So explain what is the suspicious activity. Suspicious activity is not standing on the side of the street or walking down the street. We ask you to describe the person not around their color of skin, for example, but things like what are they wearing. So we force you into much more of a way to describe a true potential crime and safety issue happening, which is important for safer neighborhoods. And we see this happen in Australia all the time. People say, hey, someone tried to, jimmy my window last night. Someone tried to break into my garage. And it's a way to tell the neighborhood to be a little more careful. But that slowing down is incredibly important. And actually we've seen from a racial profiling perspective, once we slowed people down, racial profiling moderated posts fell by almost 80%.
I'm just wondering if kindness reminders might work in Parliament, Mark. But, it sounded like you were calling for that at the beginning of the program. But actually going to move on quickly because we've got a couple of questions on Labor's post-mortem. The first one's from Christopher.
Speaking of kindness.
Christopher Masson.
Like many Australians, I was bitterly disappointed by the election result, and shortly afterwards I joined the Labor Party. But since becoming a member, I've been increasingly frustrated by the party's lack of direction and the messaging from frontbenchers who continue to espouse that Labor should continue with a bold progressive agenda and not paint itself as a small target or liberal light, while simultaneously they fold on every issue and, and they're unable to gain any traction. Most disappointingly was, of course, that people openly floated the idea of abandoning climate change policies. Sorry.
No, that's okay. I think we've got the.
No, keep on going.
Yeah. Okay.
Sorry.
Well, no. I'm
going to do it.
I think it's a T-shirt that's just.
Maybe. No. I'd hoped that the post-mortem would reset this conversation, but Albanese's performance on Insiders yesterday would seem to contradict that. I understand that there'll be a period of recalibration after such a loss, but when will it end? Where are the new ideas? Where is the ambition? Or should we all look forward to another 12 months of frontbenchers equivocating when asked if franking credits will be retained or jettisoned?
Okay, so you pulled a big question out at the end there. No, that's fantastic. Right. Thank you very much, Mark.
It's good to have franking credits dropped on the table right at the end.
Yeah.
Well, welcome to the party. I hope you stay. We need you.
Really?
First of all, it was important that we conduct a review, a very searing review after losing our third election in a row. And I've talked a bit about the scale of this particular loss. This was not a loss against John Howard at the height of his powers. This was a loss against a government that, frankly, I think they'd even admit in their honest moments, had been pretty divided and a bit of a rabble. So it's important that we have a very serious look at why we lost an election that I think everyone expected us to win. But the delivery of the report last week, Anthony's speech at the National Press Club, really should draw a line under that. We've had a series of recommendations that were given to us by Jay Weatherill and Craig Emerson. We've accepted them all at the National Executive, and it's about implementation and moving forward now. As Anthony has said, as we lead into our national conference at the end of next year, there will be a very serious discussion about our broad principles, our vision. Now, that doesn't mean that we'll be reviewing our core values. As I've said, as the person with responsibility for climate change policy, we will not be reviewing our commitment to climate action that is consistent with what scientists have told us we need to do to keep global warming well below 2 degrees and to pursue efforts around 1.5 degrees.
So, yes, so your targets around climate change simply won't change no matter what some people in the party are saying. Is that what you're suggesting?
Well, the inevitable consequence of the Paris Climate Agreement that was described earlier is that our economy and other economies around the world need to be at net zero emissions by the middle of the century. You need to have a series of medium-term targets that are consistent with that trajectory.
So the targets that are set in place now, they won't change. Is that what you're saying?
Those key points will change over time. The 2030 target was something being discussed in the middle of the last decade as a number of states stakeholders have made clear, the Carbon Markets Institute and others have made clear, by the time we get to the next election, the world will be discussing 2035 targets, not 2030 targets. So the point, as a matter of principle, though, is to be on the pathway to net zero emissions by 2050 and not expect that we're going to do all the work in 2048 and 2049. To get on with it now, because the longer we delay it, the harder it is for future generations and the more we miss out on the jobs and investment that Ross talks about in his book. So, yes, we'll look at our policies, but we're not going to review our core commitment to climate action, a generational responsibility to our children and grandchildren, any more than a review of our health policies is going to reconsider our commitment to Medicare. Our core values will remain in place and they'll be the subject of the gradual development of more detailed policies between now and the next election.
Can I just interpolate here? Are you saying that the targets may change? That is, the climate change targets that you're committed to now may change, but the idea will remain the same?
Well, that's not quite how I put it. The core principle
That's what I'm asking you. That's just a
same.
question.
Look, our economy and all other economies need to get on a pathway of decarbonisation. And scientists have been very clear about the sort of steepness that pathway reflects. Now, you can choose a point in that pathway at 2030 or 2035 and really...
What's your current target?
Well, it's currently, it was at the last election, a 2030 target of 45% reduction in emissions based on 2005
and
levels.
Will that change or will that not change?
I make the point that was a target recommended by the Climate Change Authority now more than 5 years ago. And when they made that recommendation, they had in mind a 15-year implementation. By the 2022 election, we'll be over halfway through that, and the world will be thinking about 2035 targets. So we may be talking about a different number and a different date.
Could get bigger.
But the principle will remain the same. We've got to get on that pathway.
All right. So
or we'll be betraying our children and our grandchildren, and we'll miss out on the jobs.
Let's quickly hear from the other panellists. And Jason, what do you think Labor would have to do to become more competitive?
Well, that's really a question for the Labor Party.
No, it's a question for you, I just asked.
And all the sorts of things that I'm going to advise them to do, they shouldn't do. So let me put it that way. Yeah. Look, I feel for the Labor Party. I'm a member of the Liberal Party. We've had all sorts of unlosable elections that we've faced. People don't often, Tony, dare I say it yourself, don't sometimes forget that we're all human beings in politics. And
I've never forgotten you're a human being. Jason,
well, maybe not me, just others. And I think Mark and his team must be feeling very bad about what happened. I think they put in a very good election campaign. In the last Parliament, they were a very effective opposition. I hope Mark's right. They can draw a line underneath this and rejoin the contest of ideas, because that makes our Parliament better and our nation a better.
Sounds like your kindness thing's starting to work. It's just by osmosis, apparently. Sarah, what do you think?
Well, I think it's totally appropriate that the Labor Party has taken its time since its election loss to consider where it went right and where it went wrong. And in the industry, we make a point of dealing with both governments and opposition on energy policy, because it is so important that we get these policy settings right and that we find bipartisanship opportunities where we can. So we're looking forward to re-engaging with Mark and his team once they're ready to start discussing their new policy settings.
And Ross, what do you think? I mean, you did that report for the Rudd government, really. So you were working with a Labor government with high hopes. What are your views now about the current Labor setup?
Well, I think that we do need, first of all, to be clear that we've got to be zero net emissions before mid-century for us to play our part in the global effort. That's clear from the science. Our Climate Change Authority advised us on that. It's there in the Paris Agreement. That's the core of the Paris Agreement. Everything else is subsidiary to that objective. Once we're clear on that, and once we understand that it's actually cheaper and has many economic advantages for us in moving quickly rather than leaving it all to the last moment, then we'll push aside all sorts of arguments for going slower to protect some little interest or other that's getting in the road of jobs and incomes and opportunity for Australians, as well as for dealing with the very big problem of climate change. So I think the most important thing is for us all to share that very strong commitment to zero net emissions before mid-century, and to understand that it's going to be very costly and miss out on a lot of opportunities if we leave prompt progress for too long.
That's where we'll have to leave it. Thank you very much for joining us tonight. Please thank our panel: Sarah McNamara, Jason Falinski, Ross Garnaut, Sarah Friar and Mark Butler. Thank you very much. Now, you can continue the discussion on Facebook and Twitter. Now, next week on Q&A, we'll be straight after Australia Talks, the ABC's intensive look into the opinions of ordinary Australians on everything from sex and religion to neighbours and the cost of living. We'll be broadcasting live from Perth with the Federal Attorney-General, Christian Porter, West Australian Labor MP Anne Ali, human rights lawyer Hannah McGlade, and Fitzroy Crossing broadcaster and People's panellist Dylan Storer, who impressed so many of us when he appeared on the Q&A High School special last year. Until next Monday, good night.